Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this book launching event organized by the Romanian Cultural Institute in London. My name is Dorian Galbinski. I was born in Romania. I came to London in 1970, and I worked as a producer in the Romanian section of the BBC World Service for almost 38 years, until 2008, when the section was closed down together with other East European departments of the World Service. I'm honored to be asked by the ICR London to host this evening discussion. We will be talking to my friend and former colleague at the BBC, the journalist Petru Clej, author of a book recently published by the Meridiane Publishing House in Romania. The book is entitled 7 Love Stories from the Time of the Holocaust, Communism Era and Today, or in Romanian, 7 povești de dragoste din vremea Holocaustului, comunismului și azi. I'll start by asking you, Petru, what prompted you to write this book?
Thank you very much, Dorian. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked by my editor, Mrs. Adriana Nazarchuk, about 4 years ago, to write a book about the Romanian Holocaust, knowing my interest, my keen interest in this topic for more than 30 years. At that time, I didn't have enough material because this book will be entirely filled with my original materials gathered over 30 years. But over the past 2 years, I filled that gap. And last autumn, the Romanian Parliament adopted a bill which provided for compulsory education about the history of Jews and the Holocaust in Romania. And this will start beginning in September 2023. And we had a discussion, Adriana and I, and we thought that there should be an alternative approach to this, in that literature can be a complementary approach to teaching such a delicate topic as the history of Jews and the Holocaust. So this led to the idea to write these 7 love stories, which are basically love stories between the Jews and non-Jews in these troubled times.
This bill you mentioned, which was approved by Romanian Parliament last year, do you think it was a good idea? Is there any other country in the world having such a law to teach the Holocaust and the history of the Jews as a separate subject, compulsory in schools? I mean, I know that Germany has a similar, I don't know whether it's a law, similar rule. Holocaust is taught in schools. I don't know whether it's a separate subject or it's compulsory.
In Germany, it has been compulsory for a very, very long time. And not only teaching the Holocaust at various levels, but also there is a compulsory visit to a former concentration camp or death camp for almost all students. Is it a good idea for Romania? I don't know, and it's not for me to say. But at present, it is taught as a subject within the curriculum. It's not mandatory, and as far as I know, it is taught in very, very few schools.
Well, if only Germany has such a law, and if we make the comparison between Germany and Romania, Germany had a much nastier history of behavior towards the Jews than Romania. Romania is almost nothing compared to what the Germans did in the Second World War. So why should Romania have a legislation similar to Germany?
Well, let me put this in context. According to the Wiesel report, which was published in 2004, an international commission compiled by an international commission about the Holocaust in Romania, they found out that Romania was responsible for the death of between 280 and 380,000 Jews and 11,000 Roma. And this places Romania in the second place behind Germany. And remember, Romania was at the time and is at present a much smaller country. But leaving figures apart, I think that teaching the history of the Holocaust in a democratic country is an act of democracy in itself, because the Holocaust was the first large-scale massacre, genocide, entirely planned and put in practice at some point with industrial means. It's been how long? 77 years since the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And many people today have no idea what this meant. And there's also the fact that Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism are on the up.
Since the end of the Second World War in 1945, the Holocaust has been the subject of many books, many films, documentaries, and articles, and so on. They haven't seemed to have reduced the level of anti-Semitism, as you mentioned. Actually, some people say that anti-Semitism has increased. So many countries adopted laws against anti-Semitism, like prosecuting cases of Holocaust denial. Do you think that legislation is useful to not to eradicate, but even to reduce the level of anti-Semitism? Can it be done by legislation?
No, obviously it can't, and nothing can be done, achieved exclusively by legislation. You mentioned anti-Semitism. I mean, look around you, around us in London, and we have physical violence against Jews almost every week in a country which has not known Nazism or communism. So obviously there has to be a deterrent for hate speech and indeed physical violence, racially and or ethnically or religiously motivated. But and this here I return to my book. My book is a celebration of love, which in some cases can defeat hate, and hope can defeat the hopelessness, which was a general feeling during the Holocaust.
So, you are trying to fight off anti-Semitism through literature. Tell us a few words about the 7 stories in your book.
The 7 stories occur largely in Romania. 5 of them start during the Holocaust and continue, some of them until the present day. One of them happens under the communist regime in Romania, and the last one is a love story between an Israeli Jew and a Muslim Palestinian. And the story starts in the year 2000 in Jerusalem. And obviously, coincidentally, the two lovers have connections with Romania.
Most of your characters have suffered from some kind of discrimination, either racial, religious, economic, social, and so on. They lived in the 30s, 40s, 50s, some of them until today. How does what they went through compare to what is happening now in the world? Do you, for instance, see any similarity, let's say, with what some Romanians must have experienced in other countries of the European Union, which, by the way, was created precisely to eradicate racism, nationalism, and racial hatred, which all led to so many wars in the past?
No, not at all, because as I said, the Holocaust was genocidal, and it was planned, and you were chucked into cattle trucks and sent off to the territory of Transnistria, which was under Romanian occupation between 1941 and 1944. Others were simply shot, summarily executed in the summer of 1941. In the summer of 1942, over 25,000 Roma were deported to Transnistria by the fascist leader of Romania, Ion Antonescu. So, in that respect, they had no chance. They were born Jews or Roma or Gypsies, as they were called then. Whereas today, let's not forget, this is mainly an economic migration. And there is discrimination, obviously, on ethnic grounds, on racial grounds, on social grounds. But I wouldn't say that it compares to what happened 80 years ago. And that's why it is important to remind people what happened 80 years ago, because this mustn't happen again.
Coming back to anti-Semitism, there are some people who say that not every apparently anti-Semitic remark is anti-Semitic. That some of them are expressions of stupidity, lack of culture, copycat manifestations, and so on, but not anti-Semitism as such. And I have a very good personal example. When I lived in South London, I befriended a neighbor of mine, David was his name, an engineer. He was married, he had two girls who played with my daughter. And one day he confessed to me that he's racist. He said, "I hate blacks." I said, "David, you don't mean that. We are very friendly with your neighbor, an Egyptian lady. And her daughter was playing with our kids." And he said, but she's different. She's an educated woman. She drinks whiskey with us. I said, "David, imagine the following scenario. You have two neighbors. One is white like you, beats his children, beats his wife, gets drunk every week, and even takes drugs. On the other side of your house, there is a black engineer like you with kids, and he has exactly the same lifestyle as you. With whom are you going to be friends?" And he thought for a few seconds and he said, with a black, of course. I said, so you see, you are not racist. If you discriminate culturally. And he agreed. So many people might be wrong when they say that they are racist or anti-Semitic or something like that. Do you agree?
Well, it's a very fine line between stupidity and intention. And it's difficult to find where stupidity ends and bad faith starts. But you see, picking up on your question, again, shows the importance of education and the need for people to be involved, informed. And if coming back to my stories, you can see that although it's literature and the characters are fictitious, I use a lot of historical background information, which is 100% accurate, because my theory is that you cannot fight anti-Semitism with emotion first and foremost. You have to have a cool head and you have to use facts. I remind you of the film from 2016, Denial, which is probably the best example, and it has influenced me on how to fight anti-Semitism.
I would like to stay a bit longer with this thing I mentioned earlier. You remember very well that a few years ago, at football matches where Tottenham Hotspur played, the fans of the opposite side used to make this sound,
hissing sound,
copying the sound made by cyclone gas in Germany when gassing Jews. Do you think they were anti-Semitic or simply stupid and copycat manifestations?
Well,
most of them were youngsters. They had no idea. They had never probably heard of the Holocaust.
Well, it's difficult to believe because we live in an era of the internet, of instant communication, and we live in Britain where any racial, xenophobic, anti-Semitic behavior is very quickly condemned, and those who do these things are very harshly reprimanded, and sometimes remember this for the rest of their lives. So I don't think it was only stupidity, because somebody has come with the idea and it was carried out and it was disgraceful.
That's the same thing applied to the internet. The internet has a lot to answer for many, many things. Does it have to answer also for the increase in anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. I know this from personal experience. I posted an article about an American professor asking famous professor in Cluj, Marta Petreu, who had said that the famous national poet Mihai Eminescu was not anti-Semitic, to correct this statement. And I posted the articles, and there were over probably 200 comments. And these comments were probably 80% or even more negative, some of them insulting, many of them anti-Semitic, because it's very easy to post these comments. Responsibility is almost nil, because although Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism are criminalized in Romania, in 20 years, only one person was prosecuted and convicted of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. So the anti-Semitism was boosted by the internet many times over.
This is another thing very difficult to understand. These comments, these reactions, negative reactions to some of accusations of anti-Semitism, not against people of today, but against people who lived and ruled Romania 80 years ago. I mean, why would somebody who lives now in Romania be so defensive and start to accuse and even insult the author of an article? I tried to explain once in an article, look, we are not blaming you. And the blame should not be with you because you were not even born when these things happen. Why is this reaction, do you think? Is it a sort of tribalism or what?
Well, let me tell you, when the advert for my book was posted on the editing house, Meridiane Publishing editing house website, there were a few comments, and some of them were indirectly negative, and I always ask them, do you like love stories? And one of them said, no, I like love stories, but I don't like them from you, Petru Clej. So obviously, many people have a connection through nationalism to even to the leaders who ruled 80 years ago. And all of this stems from the fact that during these 80 years, we had 50 years of communism, 45 years of communism, and then 32 years during which, in the name of freedom of speech, all sorts of lies and disinformation was spread by the resurgent far right and by former communists. So it's not surprising that today you have this sort of personal defensive reaction when somebody accuses the Antonescu regime of the Holocaust in Romania. Not accuses, just this is a simple fact. They take a personal offense. So again, this is the importance of informing people, of educating people.
Yes, I'm aware of many of negative comments against your articles on anti-Semitism. But when did your book appear?
My book appeared in electronic format in late December and appeared in print on the 14th of January 2022.
It's a bit too early, but did you have any reactions to the book, to the stories in the book?
Yes, there were a few interviews in the Romanian language media in Romania and in the Republic of Moldova. I had very positive reactions from people who have already read the book, among them Holocaust survivors, a 90-year-old historian, Lia Benjamin, who posted a very emotional comment on the website. And I have almost 4,900 friends on Facebook. Obviously, many of them have greeted this book with joy. And I think there was an article, a review written by a gentleman called Dan Romashcanu on the internet, which said that in terms of literature, this is the first book in Romanian which deals with love stories between Jews and non-Jews. And to be honest, I think that was the best review that I had.
Yeah, I know there are cases of marriages between Jews and non-Jews, even in Romania and Russian communist apparatchik. Stalin had some ministers married to Jewish ladies.
Yes, but remember, these my characters are ordinary people, although some of them are quite lead some quite comfortable lives before the Holocaust. And all of a sudden, the Holocaust became the great leveler. And my stories show that even in the direst of situation, love finds a way to fight hate. And this is what happened. One of the stories happens in Bogdanovka in Transnistria. And Bogdanovka, on the banks of the river Bug, is the place where, under the Antonescu regime, 48,000 Jews were killed. It is the place with the largest human toll of what was called the Holocaust by bullets, as opposed by opposition to the Holocaust by gassing. So this Holocaust by bullets happened in the former Soviet Union. It was carried out mainly by the Germans and by the Romanians. And one of my stories occurs there, in this pit of evil, which was Bogdanovka.
Stories, these love stories, are they real life stories? Are they inspired from life, or are they pure fiction?
The characters, as I said, are purely fictitious. But let me tell you my first story, which happens in Iași during the pogrom carried out by the Antonescu regime with the participation of the German military in June and July 1941. So at the beginning of the Second World War for Romania, a week after Romania declared war against the Soviet Union alongside Nazi Germany. And the toll was in Iași between 13 and 14,000 dead. And there is a story, a real life story, whereby a Romanian woman, a young woman called Elisabeta Nicopoi, saves, she was a simple seamstress, and she saves the life of a worker called Marcus Strul and his family by hiding them. And after the war, they fall in love, they get married, and they emigrate to Israel. And many years after that, their only son discovers the story of his mother's saving his father, and he manages to inform and then to obtain from the Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem in Jerusalem that his mom is awarded the highest title which Israel awards to non-Jews who saved Jews during the Holocaust, putting their life in danger. Hasidah Umot HaOlam, which means righteous among the nation. And it was many years later, because Elisabeta Nicopoi was very reluctant alongside her husband to talk about what had happened. And she survived together with him. She died in 2013, age 93. And today she's honored finally in Iași, not with the name of the street, there's just a plaque in her honor, alongside other 5 Romanians who saved Jews in those days in Iași. So this was the inspiration for my first story, and to tell you the truth, it's the one that I'm most attached to.
How many Romanians have received this award, this title of Rights Among the Nations?
There are 69 in Romania and 79 in the Republic of Moldova, which at that time didn't exist. So Bessarabia, the territory on which the Republic of Moldova is mostly based today, was part of Romania. Also, a higher number in Ukraine. But the number is very small compared to countries like, obviously, Poland, but also countries like
also
Belgium.
Very small compared to the good deeds did
absolutely. And let me tell you why.
I have a personal case in my family. My uncle and his family were saved in Bucharest by a neighbor who was an ironmonger, Christian, and he hid them during the Legionnaire night in 49, the rebellion.
Yeah, the pogrom from 21st to 23rd of January 1940.
By this ironmonger who saved their lives, and he's not right among the nations. But
yeah, let me tell you why. Because, for example, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in France, where there were many fewer Jews deported and persecuted than in Romania, there are well over 1,000. And the explanation is very simple, because those were democratic countries which allowed Yad Vashem and the State of Israel to carry out the checks, because there are very serious checks in order to award the title of righteous among the nations. Whereas in Romania and in the Soviet Union, they weren't keen at all, because they didn't want the communists were not keen to show that Jews were the main victims of the Nazis and the fascists. They were like Romanian citizens or Soviet citizens. So by the time the communist regime collapsed, many of the righteous were either dead or the supporting evidence had disappeared.
Probably your book might have a following in Israel, especially among people over the age of 60 or 70. But do you think it might have a following in Britain? After all, we have problems in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants. We have cases of anti-Semitism, as we mentioned, of Islamophobia, all kinds of other racial tensions, and so on. Do you think your book, translated into English, might appeal to the British readers?
I think so. And I think that, first of all, these are love stories. And it's not very often there are in universal literature stories about love stories between Jews and non-Jews. So it will obviously appeal to people of all ages and all races and all classes. How can not a love story appeal? But we talked about anti-Semitism, and frankly speaking, the two of us, we spoke often in the past about the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Britain, and as I said, in London. So I think there is a public there. Obviously, if translated, I would have to rewrite some of the historical background to make it clearer for a British audience. But by and large, I think it would appeal to English readers.
And obviously, if you translate it, you have also to try to explain the environment, the atmosphere, and other characteristics of the East European countries to a Western audience.
Well, I don't think that it is very difficult, because there's been many novels about the Holocaust, and by and large, the Romanian Holocaust follows the usual script. So there are a few characteristics for Romania, but the bottom line is inhumanity towards your fellow men and women. So I don't think it's a huge challenge.
Well, you've been written about anti-Semitism, if I remember correctly, since the 90s, when you did this documentary about Transnistria, Northern Bukovina, Bessarabia, and so on. So it's 30 years at least you've been dealing with the subject. What do you think? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, first of all, let me tell you that my first article, my first interview was with the then Chief Rabbi Moses Rosen in 1991. 50 years, when they marked 50 years after the Bucharest pogrom. And then that documentary in 1998 about the Romanian Holocaust. Where do we go from here? I think, as I said, from my personal point of view, I want to complete this book and publish it in the autumn of this year. And alongside these fiction, the 7 love stories, they can be used as props for starting in September 2023, when the history of Jews and the Holocaust becomes mandatory in Romanian schools. So this is an alley, but obviously much more needs to be done in terms of information and education, because it's the only way. As we talked earlier, legislation has a limited impact.
Many people say that what is labeled an anti-Semitic remark is in fact an anti-Israeli remark, a very clear distinction. Do you think that if sometime in the future Israel will be at peace with all its neighbors, anti-Semitism in the world will abate?
Personally, I'm very skeptical that anti-Semitism can be eradicated. And as you know, I wrote an article about that, because anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred in history. It is 2,600 years old, at least, documented. And
would you say that it became like rain? One cannot stop it.
No, yes, you cannot stop it, but you can shield from it. So we can minimize it. We mustn't abandon fight against anti-Semitism, as we mustn't abandon fight against any form of hate, be it racial hatred, homophobia, misogynism, and any other hate in modern society. So that's why, again, I come back to my book. I think my book must must bring a modest contribution to fighting anti-Semitism and any form of hatred.
If at least one reader changes his mind after reading your book, you'll be happy.
Well, as I say, and you know, I quote this as a subtitle: "He who saves a life saves the whole world." So, if I can convince at least one reader to give up anti-Semitism, fine.
Petru Clej, journalist and author, living in London, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.
Goodbye.